Good afternoon. And welcome to our Spring Dialogues and Action Series presentation. We have, as a very, very special keynote today, Dr. Michael Brownstein, who is actually a professor of philosophy at John Jay College, part of the CUNY system. And we are really in for a treat today. This program, as many of you know because you've heard me say this several times, is part of our UACCESS, which is University of Albany collaboratively creating excellence, scholarship, and success. And this program is really based on helping the university really embrace diversity and inclusion. So these dialogues are really geared for that. And so I'm hoping today, again, as we begin to welcome our speaker, who will be introduced by Professor Jason DeCruz, I really look forward to, again, an interactive session, because that's really what's important here. As you know, we have two dialogues that are going on campus right now. One, which is facilitated by Professors Los Coca and Little, for our faculty, and one that is coordinated for our staff by Equal King. So we really hope that you will engage yourself and really help us celebrate diversity and inclusion on this campus. This is a very important dialogues that we're really talking about here, and I'm really looking forward to the presentation today. So without further ado, I'd ask Dr. DeCruz to come up and introduce our keynote today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Deborah. We've been very grateful for the cooperation that we've had with the Office of Diversity and Inclusion and the Philosophy Department. So you may know that Dr. Michael Brownstein was here on Friday. He gave the keynote talk for our symposium on implicit bias that was run by the Minorities in Philosophy group, and we're really grateful to have him back today on Monday. So Dr. Brownstein is an assistant professor at John Jay College at the City University of New York, and he is quickly become a leader in the field of thinking about implicit bias and its relation to philosophy. He's the co-editor of two forthcoming anthologies with the Oxford University Press of implicit bias in philosophy. The first volume is on the metaphysics and epistemology of implicit bias, and the second volume is on moral responsibility, structural injustice, and ethics relating to implicit bias. He's the author of a number of papers on implicit bias and moral responsibility, implicit bias, context and character, as well as papers on ethical automaticity and flow. So he's presently a visiting scholar at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and concurrently a fellow of the American Council of Learned Societies. He's working on a book project there that brings together in a very interesting and interdisciplinary way aspects of practical rationality and moral agency in philosophy with research on implicit attitudes from social psychology. His work in progress is called On the Virtues and Vices of Spontaneity. And today we have him talking about some of the implications of implicit bias and implicit attitudes in the classroom. I'm really excited and looking forward to hearing what Michael has to say. So without further ado, I'll give over the podium to Dr. Michael Brownstein.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me. I've been told that I should not cross an imaginary line between the speakers. So if I do that sort of just in the flow of things and you get audio feedback that I can't hear, will you just wave your hand or something like that? Okay. The other thing I wanted to say is just to please feel free to ask questions, interrupt as I go. The talk I have planned is somewhere 45, 50 minutes long, so that should give us lots of time to talk afterwards as well. But I do want to encourage everyone to feel as much a part of the conversation as possible, and we'll do a little bit of participatory stuff about 10 or 15 minutes in or so. Okay, so here's the talk. I'm going to focus on implicit bias, and in particular in higher education in the classroom. So this is going to be tiny for people in the back, and I apologize for that. If at any point you want me to just read something that I didn't read anyway, just let me know. So the talk has 5 parts. I'll begin by just talking about some facts about discrimination in contemporary Western democracies like ours. And then I'll introduce you to some of the kind of textbook facts about implicit bias, and in particular how implicit biases are measured. Then sort of hone in on some of the ways in which implicit biases are at work in the classroom and in universities more broadly. And then we'll talk some about ideas for combating implicit bias and changing our behavior. And then just quickly at the end, I'll point you to some resources for learning more. So modern forms of discrimination. The first thing to say is that old-fashioned explicit prejudice still exists. There are racists and bigots and sexists. I don't think this is going to surprise anyone in this room to say this. But at the same time, some things have changed. And a good way, I think, to get our hands around some of the things that have changed is by looking at surveys of people's attitudes, basically what people will say about social groups. So if you look back to 1928 to one of the sort of canonical studies in social psychology, a study by L.L. Thurstone called Attitudes Can Be Measured. This is really one of the first quantitative attempts to measure people's social attitudes. And what he did was he was at the University of Chicago, and he gave a whole bunch of students pairings of what he called ethnicities and nationalities. And he simply said, whom do you prefer? And so there were a whole bunch of pairings. Do you prefer Italians to Germans? Do you prefer Hindus to Americans? And in these weird sort of ways that we wouldn't do today, where he's crossing cultural groups, religions, nationalities, and so on. And one of the pairings he gave was between Americans and Negroes. And he said, who do you prefer, Americans or Negroes? So one of the ways we can see how things have changed is just in virtue of the way he put that pairing, right, in distinguishing Americans from Negroes. But another way in which we can see how things have changed is the results of his survey, which showed that that was the American-Negro pairing was one of the most discrepant responses. So of all the pairings that he gave people, of all these ethnicities and nationalities, he found that one of the largest majorities was everybody agreeing that they preferred Americans to Negroes. Now, if you compare that to studies today of people's attitudes towards social groups, you find a very dramatic change. So one instance is a study of over 700,000 participants in 2007 by a psychologist named Brian Nosek at the University of Virginia. And he simply asked people, do you prefer white people or black people? And the most common answer was, I have no preference. So this is a change. It's a dramatic change. At the same time, it comes as no surprise to anyone in this room, I'm sure, that discrimination consists in societies like ours pervasively and brutally. And so what I want to do is just sort of walk through some areas of contemporary social group membership-based discrimination to contrast with this way in which people's attitudes, or at least the attitudes that they report, have changed. So if we look at judgment tasks where we have to evaluate resumes, CVs, job applications, we see patterns of discrimination. So one study from 2004 sent out a bunch of CVs to people, I think this was also in the Chicago area. All the CVs were identical except for the name at the top. And at the name at the top, the experimenters put on some of the CVs white male sounding name, at the top of other ones a white woman or a name that most people would think would belong to a white woman. There were 4 groups total, so the third was black-sounding names of men, and then black-sounding names of women. What they found was that the white-sounding names received 50% more callbacks than the black-sounding names, regardless of things that you might think would mediate the finding. Occupation, industry, employer, socioeconomic status. That's to say, of the person doing the evaluating. In a study on gender in universities, this is more recent, Corinne Moser-Cusin found that male applicants for a lab manager position were rated more competent, more hireable, and offered higher starting salaries than female applicants with the exact same application materials. Again, so this is a study using a fictitious candidate, regardless of the gender of the evaluator. And these were faculty evaluators at research-intensive universities. If we look at another area of contemporary life, medicine, we find bias pervasive as well. One study found across over 1 million participants, or samples in this case, that black children were less likely to receive an antibiotic prescription, as well as a diagnosis that justified antibiotic treatment, controlling for age, gender, condition, insurance, and stratification. And this is consistent with large-scale reviews that find discrimination across various areas of treatment for cardiac disease and cancer and so on. Okay, third sort of set of examples that I want to just throw on the table for now, looking at policing behavior and criminal sentencing. I think, again, this is probably going to surprise nobody in the room, that reviews find widespread disparities by race in profiling, shooting behavior, and sentencing. I want to just describe one lab-based measure that I think really sort of brings this phenomenon home. So if you'll recall, in 1999 in the Bronx, a man named Amadou Diallo was shot by the New York City police. Turned out he was unarmed. The police supposedly mistook his wallet for a gun. And obviously, this is a pattern that we've seen in the news recently as well. So after the shooting of Amadou Diallo, some psychologists got together and said, how can we show that this really does have to do with race in some way? And so they said, all right, well, let's come up with a simulation. So imagine that you came into the lab and you were told you're going to just sit down at a computer screen and you're going to see images of people holding either guns or harmless objects like cell phones. And your goal is simply to decide to shoot all and only those people shown holding guns. You're going to have to do it quickly in order to simulate the kind of high-pressure decision-making that cops have to make. And so we're going to show you these images, and you're just going to either press a button for shoot or a button for not shoot. So the images will look something like this, or like this, or like this. I don't know how well you can see, but on a computer screen, if you have time, the images are not that ambiguous. You can tell, like that in this case, he's holding a cell phone. When they go by quickly and you have to make rapid decisions, it's not that easy. And the results are perhaps not surprising, again, to everyone here. The results are that, by and large, people are more likely to shoot an unarmed black man than to shoot an unarmed white man. And they're also more likely to fail to shoot an armed white man than an armed black man. Okay, I'm going to come back to these patterns of discrimination in a minute, because the suggestion I want to make is that implicit bias has at least something to do with these phenomena. It's not going to be the whole story. It's not going to provide a complete explanation. But if we've got a kind of puzzle, which is to say, people's attitudes seem to have changed so dramatically over the last 50 or 75 or even 100 years, and yet these patterns of discrimination persist. We've got a sort of puzzle for explaining that, and I want to suggest that implicit bias is at least part of the explanation for that puzzle. So roughly speaking, implicit biases are relatively unconscious or relatively automatic features of judgment and social behavior. But the definition is a rough and ready one because really the field that studies implicit bias, which is referred to as the field looking at implicit social cognition in psychology, really the field is one that's been driven by its advances in measurement technique. So it's really come as no surprise to anyone that people's explicit statements don't capture the whole of what they think and feel, right? We've known this for a very long time. But it's been kind of a holy grail in psychology to figure out how to measure the attitudes that people have that they're not willing to simply tell you. And this is why the field of implicit social cognition has been one of the fastest growing in research psychology over the last 20 or 30 years, is because of these advances in measurement technique. So the first thing to understand is the distinction between an that should say direct at the top. So the difference between an explicit or direct measure and an implicit or an indirect measure. Explicit and direct is not exactly the same thing. Implicit and indirect is not exactly the same thing, but they're close enough for now. And if you want me to expound on that, I can. So an explicit or a direct measure is one that simply asks you to state your opinions. So if what we're talking about are attitudes about race, an example might be something called the modern racism scale. It's simply a questionnaire, series of questions that's designed to elicit your attitudes towards a particular social group. And there's many varieties of these sorts of explicit questionnaire type surveys on offer. An implicit or indirect test is a little bit harder to get our hands around. Generally speaking, it's a test that weighs the strength of an association in your mind between a concept, say the concept male or the concept white, and an attribute, say the concept logical or the concept scientific. It can also measure an association between a concept and an evaluation, that is to say a liking or a disliking. And implicit or indirect measures are ones that measure those associations without requiring that the test subject, the person being asked, be aware of the relationship between their response and what's being measured. A simpler way to put that is that indirect or implicit measures are eliciting our attitudes or, again, our associations between concepts and attributes without having to ask us directly what they are. There's a whole slew of these kinds of measures on offer if what we're talking about is social cognition. And what I want to do is sort of walk our way through the most common one and the most widely used one. So instead of sort of just trying to grasp it abstractly, it's better to just actually sort of do it. So first thing I want you to imagine doing is sorting cards. So imagine that I gave you a deck of cards, and I said I want you to sort this deck into two different piles. On the left, I want you to put all the hearts and the clubs. And on the right, I want you to put all the spades and the diamonds. And I want you to do this as fast as you can, and I want you to make as few mistakes as you can. Okay? That would not be super hard, right? Now imagine I asked you to, okay, let's shuffle the deck and let's do it again, or I just compared your performance to someone else's performance in a second categorization task. And this time I said, okay, all the hearts and the diamonds to the left, and all the clubs and the spades to the right. Which sort would be easier? Someone just shout it out. The bottom sort would be easier, right? Okay. Now, this is not because we have some innate affinity for hearts and diamonds going together compared with hearts and clubs going together, right? Grouping by suit is sort of arbitrary for us, right? Rather, it's that it's easier to put things of like colors together compared to things of suit together, right? Okay. All I want you to keep in mind from this little toy example is the notion of a strength of association. That is to say, when things go together in our mind, they make our behaviors easier, right? So if putting cards by color is easier than by suit together, we can go faster when we do that sorting task, and we'll make fewer mistakes. So this is the notion of ease of association or strength of association in our minds. One way you could think of it is that the concept is more available for integrating into our behavior. Okay, does that make sense, everybody? Okay, so now is when we're going to actually do a little work. So if I may, what I want to ask you to do when I say go, not yet, is to start up there where it says start. And we're going to go around in a circle. And you can just use your hands. And what I want you to do is tap your right hand. You can do it on your knee or on the table or whatever. Tap your right hand anytime you get to a flower word, and your left hand every time you get to an insect word. And we're going to go all the way around in the circle, and the goal is to do it as fast as you can and to make as few mistakes as you can. I'm getting a furrowed brow. Does that make sense? Okay. Anybody have questions about the task? Now, if we were doing this for real, obviously, we'd be doing it on a computer, and I'd be getting a very precise measurement of your time, but we'll be able to hear it. Okay? So when I say go, again, it's just going to be something like right tap, left tap, right tap, left tap, and so on. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's give it a try. So ready, set, go. Okay, not too difficult, I don't think, right? In fact, it sort of was, there was some synchronization. I kind of got the sense everybody was kind of going at a nice speed. Okay, so we're going to do this 4 times just to give you a heads up, okay? Sorry. This time, instead of flower and insect words, we've got good and bad words, okay? So this time, I'd like you to just tap right anytime you get a good word, and left anytime you get a bad word. Any questions? Okay, ready, set, go. Good, okay. So I would say from my ear, it sounded like not too bad. I got the same synchrony, maybe a little bit slower, and that might just be an order effect. That is to say that, excuse me, because you did the flowers and the insects first, now you have to sort of switch in your mind, right? But not too hard just in virtue of the nature of the task. Okay, now it's going to get a little harder. So now I'd like you to tap right anytime you get to a good word or a flower word, and left anytime you get to a bad word or an insect word. Am I standing in the way? Can you guys see? Does that make sense? Okay, ready, set, go. Good. Okay, so I'm guessing this was slightly harder than the previous 2. Tell me again when I say I guess if you had a different experience. But because you're keeping track of more concepts here, you should be going a little bit slower, not necessarily intentionally, but the task is a little bit harder. Does that seem right? Okay, so this is now the last time, okay? So this time it's going to be right for good words or insects, and left for bad words or flower words, okay? Okay, so I get the sense you know what's coming now already, just from hearing you. Let's give it a try. Ready, set, go. All right, I'm cutting the stragglers off. Good. Okay, good. So this got even more difficult, correct? Okay. So it should. This was meant to be a little more difficult. Now, before we talk about why, which I'm going to guess you're on to already, I want you to just see that we could have done this on a computer very easily rather than just tapping, right? So I could have said, I'm going to show you pictures of insects, and press the D key if you see those. And I'm going to show you pictures of flowers. Press the K key if you see those. If you see a negative word, press the D key. If you see a positive word, press the K key. Sorry, I said D key. I said K, I meant D. Okay. Does that make sense, right? So this is just a sort of public version of what you might be doing if you were taking a test on the computer. Similarly, we can break the last 2 go-rounds that you did up into 2 different kinds of trials. So the third go-round that you did was like this one, because you were tapping one side for bad words and insects, and the other side for good words and flowers. And then the last trial you did switched the category groupings such that you were doing one side for bad words and flowers and the other side for good words and insects. So it sounded like people agreed that they could even feel the difficulty of doing this trial compared to the previous one. So why is that? Someone want to take a stab at that? Another way of asking the question is, why are we calling this grouping a congruent trial and this one an incongruent trial? Congruent and incongruent with what? Yeah?
The way that you associate them in your mind?
Yeah, that's right. And in particular, the strength of association, you might say, going back to what I was trying to say before, right? So the suggestion is that this trial, the congruent trial, is easier. And by easier, I very specifically mean you can go faster and you make fewer mistakes because most of us associate insects with negative words more easily than we associate flowers with negative words, and vice versa. We more easily associate positive words with flowers than we do positive words with insects. So this is called a congruent trial because it's congruent with common attitudes towards flowers and insects. A simpler way of saying that is that most people like flowers more than they like insects. There will be outliers. So if you give this flower-insect test to entomologists, they might score differently. But what's interesting is that you might find people in the population who are explicit insect lovers but implicit flower lovers. Right? So that is to say, they might say, you know what, flowers are boring, everybody likes flowers, I really like insects, but they will still find it easier to do this categorization task in a congruent trial than an incongruent trial. And now, hopefully, you're seeing forward where we're going with this, that situation in which someone says, I don't have any associations between, say, women and the concept of reading compared to men and the concept of math, may still find it easier to do a test like this where the pictures in the words are not flowers and insects, but are men and women and math and reading concepts. So that would look something like this. So here it's the exact same concept, but we've switched the terms. So on the left, we've got boy as a category, and math as a category. On the right, girl as a category, and reading as a category, and then an item list that's going to come up sequentially. So if you can't see, it would be story, Emily, graph, David, numbers, Hannah. And so when numbers comes up, the idea is to press left because this is a math word, and so on and so forth. Right? Does that make sense to people? This one is going to be called a stereotype congruent trial. So we've sort of introduced the word stereotype here. And this one over here, where boy and reading are together versus girl and math are together, is the stereotype incongruent trial. And that's because this is supposed to represent common social stereotypes that people have relating gender to math and reading concepts. Make sense? What you find is that the stereotype congruent and incongruent trials do, in fact, bear out. So on this, on a related study, not looking at reading and math per se, but science and liberal arts, you find that of 500,000 people tested, about 70% associate science with male. And again, that just means that they go faster and they make fewer mistakes on the stereotype congruent trial than the incongruent one. And so you might think, so what? This is just pressing buttons in a computer lab or on the internet? Well, in this case, the so what is that this particular implicit test predicted national gender differences in levels of science achievement of 8th graders. This is just one of many of what's called the implicit association test, which is the most commonly used and most well-validated of a whole slew of implicit or indirect measures of attitudes. So what you're looking at here is a screenshot of what's called the race evaluation implicit association test. And so this one cycles through images of black and white faces with good and bad words cycled through. And so it's that same concept as the flower insect IAT, except not with flowers and insects. This is a screenshot of the body image IAT. This is the one that we just talked about, the science liberal arts IAT. And there are many, many others looking at attitudes toward the elderly, looking at attitudes toward foreigners versus national identity, and so on. The general idea of this test is that our implicit attitudes, including stereotypical and prejudicial ones, can be represented by the speed and the efficiency with which people associate related concepts. Say something like man with doctor. Okay? And the reason these tests are impressive is not just because of the finding that most people have stereotype congruent implicit attitudes, regardless of what they report, what they tell you. It's that these tests predict how we actually behave in the real world. And so here's where I want to go back to some of the kinds of behavior and discrimination that I talked about in the beginning. So if you go back to those judgment tasks where we're evaluating CVs and resumes, you find that implicit tests predict those kinds of patterns. So a study in Sweden, for instance, found that people who favored native Swedes over Arabs on an implicit stereotyping task were significantly less likely to offer equally qualified Arab applicants job interview opportunities. The Swedish applicants were 3 times more likely to receive callbacks. If you look at gender, you find participants in this study here by Laurie Rudman found that female applicants for a managerial position were rated equally confident, competitive, qualified, and ambitious as male candidates. However, an implicit gender stereotyping test predicted who was actually hired, so biased hiring, as well as people's liking of the candidates, right? So aside from how well they rated the candidates, just whether they liked them or not. If we look at medicine, there's a really striking study that just asked physicians, do you have preferences between white patients and black patients? They all said no. Do you have any beliefs about whether white patients or black patients are going to be more non-compliant with your recommendations? They said no. Implicit measures suggested otherwise, that they revealed preferences, implicit preferences, again, relatively unconscious preferences, favoring white Americans and implicit stereotypes relating black Americans to noncompliance. And moreover, the most striking part, the strength of the physician's pro-white implicit attitudes predicted the likelihood of treating white patients and not black patients with thrombolysis. And then lastly, if we go back to policing behavior and the shooter bias test, which is the one that I talked about before with the screenshots where you have to decide to shoot or not shoot, here too we find that implicit attitude tests of various kinds predict those results. So implicit associations in this case of images of black faces with weapons predicts the tendency to shoot in the simulation, that is to say, armed black men faster than armed white men. This holds, for what it's worth, for police officers, unless they've received training. And we can talk about the kinds of training they can do in the Q&A if you want. Another striking study, this one is a field study, so not based on lab measures. Irene Blair went to Florida and looked at a cohort of inmates who were given roughly equivalent sentences across equivalent crimes and criminal histories. She did not find race-based differences for their sentencing as such. However, within each race, what she found was that the perceived Afrocentricity of their faces predicted how harsh their sentences were. Right? So these are unsettling findings. Overall, what it looks like from several large-scale reviews is that implicit attitude measures like the IAT are predictive of discriminatory behaviors. They're moderately predictive. And in some cases, they outperform explicit tests like questionnaires like the modern racism scale. There's definitely debate about this and about the psychometric properties of the IAT. And again, if you have questions or want to ask about that, we can talk about it. Okay, so with all that said, what's going on in the classroom and in schools? Again, I don't want to promise to say anything comprehensive. Instead of that, I just want to sort of look at 5 places where I think implicit bias is likely to be affecting the judgments and the behaviors that we as teachers do in the classroom and in university settings in general. Okay, so the first is going to just be about emailing, and this is because of a recent study which suggests that whose emails we reply to or to whom we don't reply is affected by perceptions of both race and gender. This study had a large sample, over 6,000 professors, and what the experimenters did was they simply sent a fictitious email to all of those professors requesting a meeting by a potential doctoral student who wanted to discuss his or her research. And the only thing that was changed was the name of the person, and the name signaled their social category membership. And what they found was white men were ignored about 26% of the time, which in and of itself I was surprised to find. That seemed high to me. Maybe I'm wrong. And then the numbers of percentages of ignored just goes up and up and up as you go through different social categories. I don't know if you can see in the back, but by the time we're looking at doctoral students with a name suggestive of Chinese female identity, you get 47% almost of emails ignored. And similarly, you get the same pattern if you look at those professors who replied to the email but denied the meeting. You see the same trajectory of race and gender-based response. Okay. Second sort of instance where I think biases, and in particular implicit biases, are affecting us in the classroom. This is a study from the Netherlands, and it found that implicit but not explicit prejudice toward Turkish and Moroccan students compared with attitudes towards Dutch students predicted both the teacher's expectations of success as well as the actual outcomes for students. So who we think is going to do well is likely to be affected by our implicit associations. Moreover, and this is, I think, the surprising fact, because that first fact might not be that surprising, our implicit expectations has the potential to affect who actually does succeed and doesn't succeed. Okay, the third area I want to talk about where implicit bias might be affecting us in the classroom has to do with what's called positive feedback bias. So positive feedback bias is the phenomenon whereby evaluators this is a body of research that looks at both high schools and colleges, give fewer critical comments, say on essays, to students based on their social group membership. The problem with chronically giving people positive feedback when the particular work doesn't necessarily deserve it there is multiform. There's a lot of problems with positive feedback bias. So one is that it just dilutes academic challenges. So that is to say, it makes academic work seem easy, but in a false way. Second, it misleads students about how much and where to put the effort. So if students are getting good grades, but without much critical commentary, they're not improving, right? They're not tapping into your expertise about how to get better. And thirdly, it can undermine the idea that the praise that the student is getting is actually due to their achievement. Now, there's an interesting finding. So what I should say before getting into the sort of interesting nuance is that positive feedback bias is found for both Black and Latino students by professors at both high school and college levels. And the interesting nuance is that it looks to be pretty strongly mediated by the self-image that the teacher has of him or herself, and in particular, whether the teacher thinks of him or herself as egalitarian, as fair. And you can see this because if you manipulate a teacher's egalitarianism, say by asking them to imagine a time at which they were particularly fair-minded to a diverse group, you'll see positive feedback bias diminishing. If, however, you threaten their egalitarianism by asking them to remember a time when they weren't necessarily as fair as they could have been, you see positive feedback bias amplified. And so you can see this here in this graph. If you look at the gray bars here, these are the neutral conditions showing just as such positive feedback bias, where the black students are receiving less content criticism on their work than white students. And then you see the effect of threatening or boosting the egalitarianism, the egalitarian mindset of the teachers. So in the boost condition, where you're made to feel good about your egalitarian chops, you give more critical feedback, and in the threat condition, less. And again, that's just for the black essay writers. Okay. Another place, this is the fourth of 5 instances that I want to just describe in terms of implicit bias in the classroom, has to do with inclusivity and gender and race representation across the fields. So I think there's sort of a misleading idea out there that the STEM subjects are the real problem areas for race-based and gender-based inclusivity, and everything's okay in the humanities. The reality is that it's both within STEM fields and within humanities fields, there's a lot of differences. So within STEM fields, for instance, if you look at neuroscience and molecular biology, you see about equal representation by gender. But if you look at physics and computer science, you see a much worse trend where women make up fewer than 20% of PhD students. Sorry, I should have said these are in doctoral programs. And in the humanities, you see a similar sort of pattern where in some fields, you see as much as 70% women in, say, psychology and art history. But in other fields, like economics and philosophy, you see far fewer representation. So this is sort of a puzzle because it makes clear that associations of just, say, science and liberal arts are not doing at least all the work when we're talking about representation. So there was a paper in Science this year that proposed an explanation for this phenomenon. So Sarah Jane Leslie and colleagues called this the field-specific abilities belief hypothesis. And their suggestion is that underrepresentation has to do with which fields people prioritize the concept of innate intelligence or brilliance. Those fields, in other words, in which people think you have to be just really innately smart are going to be the fields in which we see the most problems with gender and race-based representativeness. And so this generates a kind of prediction. Members of any group that are stereotyped as lacking raw intellectual talent should be underrepresented if this theory is correct. And this is exactly what they found. So first, this is just gender, and on the top graph are STEM subjects, and the bottom are humanities subjects. And so what you see is, just concentrating on the STEM subjects to begin, on the y-axis here, you have percentage by gender of PhD students. And on the x-axis, you have the likelihood that people in that field say that an emphasis on that brilliance is really important. And so as the emphasis on brilliance goes higher, you see gender parity going down. So with physics and math at the bottom, neuroscience and molecular biology, earth science up at the top. And the same sort of pattern in the humanities. Education, psychology, anthropology up here, music composition, econ over here, with philosophy just in the bottom basement of everything. Now, as I said, this hypothesis should work for any social group that's stereotyped as lacking in innate intellectual brilliance. And that seems to be the case. So on the top graph here now, we have collapsed both STEM and humanities subjects. And this is looking at percent representation of Black Americans in PhD programs. And this is percent Asian Americans in PhD programs. Right? So the idea here is that Asian Americans are not stereotyped as lacking innate intellectual ability, and you see nothing like the same pattern. Okay. There's different possible mechanisms if this is indeed the case, and I think they both have to do with implicit bias. One possible mechanism is that there are implicit associations out there between men and the concept of innate talent, and these influence things like the way that people get graded, the amount of praise different students get, whose comments in class are taken more seriously, and so on. Another possible mechanism is a stereotype threat mechanism. And so this is the idea that members of groups who are stereotyped as lacking innate talent are threatened by the possibility of confirming the stereotype that they themselves are aware of by underperforming, right? They don't want to go into the field and underperform because that would confirm the stereotype that they lack innate intellectual ability. And so they avoid the domain or, ironically, underperform by, say, being anxious about confirming the stereotype. Okay, last example now. Microbehavior or microaggressions are a pervasive phenomena. They're part of everyday life. By this, I mean little minor things that we do that we don't notice ourselves doing. Things like seating distance, eye contact, speech errors, interrupting. There's a large literature suggesting that people in socially stigmatized groups suffer microaggressions commonly. That is to say, they're interrupted more, they're not, eye contact is not made as much, threatening postures, right? Not overtly threatening postures, but just a turn of the shoulders such that you're not giving someone your full attention, and so on. There are some interesting mathematical models showing how these small harms can add up to societal problems. Virginia Valian has done interesting work on this, what she calls the accumulation of advantage or disadvantage, as it were. Again, the idea being small infractions add up to big harms. Another way in which microbehavior and biased microbehavior can be a problem is that it can lead to a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. So just imagine John, who has a kind of implicit association between black people and aggressiveness. And so in class, you might think that John sits a little farther away and makes a little less eye contact with James. James can sense this, right? He can sense John's coldness and responds maybe defensively and maybe turns his shoulders and glares. So John's never heard of implicit bias, doesn't know that implicit stereotypes can influence your nonverbal behavior or microbehavior. And so John, reasonably in this situation, interprets James as being hostile, and now John's got evidence for his original implicit stereotype about black people being aggressive, right? This can be a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, and it can be hard to change. And so that's what I want to talk about now. How can we change this kind of stuff? I want to make the same caveat again, which is that I can't promise any sort of comprehensive de-biasing program, but I want to just suggest ideas, some of which are going to be kind of easy fixes, and some of which are going to be harder. And hopefully they're all things that we can envision implementing in our classrooms or in our universities readily. Okay, so the first easy fix is just to stop talking about who's smart. I think smart is a kind of code word for social group membership. I don't think we mean it that way. I think when you praise a student as just being smart, it's often well meant and it's just meant as a generic term of praise. But I think it can have an effect, and I'm again thinking of Sarah Jane Leslie's work on conceptions of innate brilliance, that it's code for sort of innately intellectually talented. And I think that's a problematic designator. Moreover, we can show experimentally that when people are told that intelligence is malleable, they perform better, particularly if they're in those groups that are stereotyped as lacking raw intellectual talent. So even 7th grade girls who are encouraged to think of intelligence as a malleable thing perform better on standardized math and reading tests. This is a piece of the broader work that Carol Dweck's been doing on what she calls growth versus fixed mindsets. And so the encouragement here is to, anytime we can, adopt ways of talking about growth mindsets. That is to say, where doing well and achieving well in our classes are a product of hard work, not being just smart. Second easy fix is anonymous grading. And I think this is probably the biggest no-brainer of them all. I think we should all be grading anonymously anytime we can. We should be evaluating application materials for academic positions anonymously. It is not hard to do, to say just anonymize CVs. And one of the resources I'll point you to at the end of the talk makes specific strategies for how to do this and to overcome some of the bureaucratic challenges that we sometimes face in anonymizing. The effects look to be quite large. So one instance, the journal Behavioral Ecology found a 33% increase in representation of female authors after switching to anonymous review. I don't know of any studies specifically looking at grading in college classrooms and what happens after a teacher switches to anonymous grading, but I would love for somebody to do that experiment. I think of anonymous grading as an example of a kind of covering strategy, which is to say that it takes decision-making off the table. And I think that we can use those sorts of covering strategies in other instances too. So if you go back to the unsettling finding about email response rates, I think a covering strategy there is to just respond to everybody's emails. Rather than make a judgment call about which emails are worth responding to. I mean, I know that we're all inundated with email. But when we make those sorts of ambiguous judgment calls, those are the moments at which implicit biases affect us. And so to whatever extent it's possible, when we can adopt a strategy that just covers all the cases and takes the decision off the table, like anonymous grading or like just replying to all emails. I mean, it seems like a good practice anyway. I think we should do it. The third easy fix is to provide critical feedback as much as we can. And in particular, critical feedback that expresses a professor's high expectations as well as the student's ability to meet those expectations. And there's experimental work that suggests that this can inoculate against stereotype threat. Okay, things get a little bit harder when we talk about how to change our microbehavior. So, you picture yourself in class giving a lecture. If you're a professor, you're trying to keep track of a million things at once. So you're trying to keep track of your outline of what topics you wanted to cover. You're making sure that you've emphasized the key points. And on top of that, you're trying to make sure that you're calling on women and men equally in the class discussion, as well as all the other social groups in your class. And on top of that, thinking that whose comments are getting taken most seriously, whose comments are receiving discussion. Right? That's a lot to keep track of at once. And it's very easy to imagine that if we are attempting to do that consciously, we're going to just trip over our feet. Right? So we need some more nuanced strategies than just effort. And so I want to try and discuss some potential strategies for that. So the first has to do with changing our implicit attitudes through intergroup contact. So intergroup contact is just the idea of involving yourself in activities with people unlike yourself. It's an idea with a long and storied history in intergroup psychology, going back to Gordon Allport's seminal work in the field. And it looks like when we talk about implicit attitudes, intergroup contact can have salutary effects. So if you look at people who've had just long-term contact in their lives, say, with gay and lesbian people, that's going to correlate with lower levels of implicit anti-gay attitudes. This is sort of the Dick Cheney effect. In addition, though, right, because not all of us are fortunate to say, not fortunate enough to have, say, a gay or lesbian person in our family, regardless of those past experiences, just short-term exposure, just short-term contact, in this case with pictures and stories of admired gay men and women, can lead to lower levels of implicit anti-gay attitudes, as well as lower discriminatory voting intentions. So how do we do this in the classroom? Right? How do we promote the kind of contact that we want, not just in the classroom, I should say, but in the university more broadly? Well, in student life, it looks like intergroup contact is valuable, say, in roommating. So one study from 2006, a field study, found that just random assignment for white students to black roommates led to lower implicit intergroup biases. In our faculty hires, it looks like having more women faculty diminishes implicit gender stereotypes among students. This was another field study that looked at, it was interesting because it compared a women's college to just the rate at which students had women professors. And the effects were that having women professors, women in positions of leadership, was what changed students' implicit associations much more than simply being at a women's college. And then lastly, super minor kinds of things like changing the images that we see peripherally in our day-to-day lives can shift implicit gender and racial stereotypes. I think of this as sort of like the contact hypothesis writ small, right? So it's not even the case necessarily that we need to have actual embodied interaction. I mean, we should have as much actual embodied interaction as we can, but we can also promote better intergroup contact just by encountering more diverse images, artwork, and so on. So if you're in a philosophy department, right, this one hits sort of close to home, you're probably used to seeing these pictures of the great old dead white philosophers all over the place. And some philosophy departments are trying to change that. One study that looked at computer science similarly found that sci-fi cues reduce women's interest and expected success in computer science. The image is not really coming through, so this is like a Dr. Spock, and there's like Star Trek posters around. These are gendered cues, and you can replace them easily, right? So if you replace them and have a kind of neutral classroom, that can lead to better inclusiveness. Okay, second general way that I want to suggest that we can slowly over time change our micro-behaviors is by trying to take other people's perspectives and specifically imagining what it's like to be someone else, to experience their, to imagine their psychological experiences. We don't have to necessarily be accurate about what their experiences are, but merely trying to do so looks like it can reduce levels of bias on the race IAT. It can promote more positive interracial interactions. This is in patients and doctors. And it can lower the tendency to deny the existence of discrimination. There's one interesting caveat about perspective taking, which is that it seems to be valuable if the person taking the other people's perspective has high self-esteem or a positive self-image. But it can lead to kind of ironic effects where you get more negative attitudes toward outgroups for people if they have low self-esteem or a negative self-image. And the reason for that is that when you try to take someone else's perspective, you sort of implicitly merge your self-concept with them. And so if you like yourself, that's a good thing to do because you transfer that positivity to the other group. But if you don't like yourself, it looks like you transfer that negativity to that group. So this is a call for liking yourself on top of everything else. Okay. I think it's also important to have the right kind of conception of what implicit biases are in order to combat them effectively. And I think the way we should think of them is like bad habits. And by doing that, we can think about how do we break habits in other areas of our life. It looks to me like from the literature there are 3 features to habit breaking. And this is what some people trying to work on racial and gender stereotypes have suggested. We need awareness, motivation, and effective tools. Or you could think of it as knowledge about implicit biases, and in particular the fact that we are all likely to have implicit biases. Motivation, that is to say caring about having those biases, believing that they have effects on our own behavior. And then tools for combating them, and that's obviously the hardest part. So I want to just discuss a couple of those tools. One of them is a form of planning that sort of has remarkably effective data. So these are called implementation intentions. You can just call them if-then plans. And the basic idea is that we all know that just adopting a goal doesn't really get us to do the things that we want all that often. This is the problem with New Year's resolutions, right? So if your goal is to eat healthy, just by telling yourself, eat healthy, eat healthy, eat healthy, you're not going to do much better, right? You are going to do better if you adopt a plan that specifies specifically when and where you're going to eat healthy. And even more specifically, the cue to which you're going to respond and the behavior you're going to perform when you encounter that cue. So if your goal is to eat healthy and you say something like, and if I get takeout tonight, then I will order something with lots of vegetables, you are more likely to stick to that goal, to be a positive goal striver, than just by virtue of telling yourself that you want to eat healthy. You might not believe me that this is so effective, but several reviews have found it to be effective across a wide range of kinds of behavior, from dieting, exercising, recycling, restraining impulses, maintaining focus, like in sports, like I'm not going to get pissed at myself if I miss a shot, avoiding binge drinking, performing well on memory, math, and Stroop tasks. All of these things have been shown to be positively affected by adopting an if-then plan, where you specify a critical cue and then a specific behavior that you're going to perform in response to that cue. This is a literature that emerged out of health behavior, but is now being looked at for its effects across a whole variety of things, including lowering IAT scores. So if you think of that shooter bias task that I showed you before, if people before the shooter bias task just say, let's say, my goal is to shoot all and only those people holding guns, you can have them say that over and over again, and it's not going to have much effect. But if you have the participants say, my goal is to shoot all and only those people shown holding guns, and if I see a black face, then I will think safe, you see a dramatic change in their shooting behavior on the shooter bias test. So how can we do this in universities? Well, we could say something like, if she's talking, then I won't. If someone who hasn't spoken yet raises her hand, then I'll call on her. If a student emails me, then I will reply. It really looks like this if-then conditional format is important for making this kind of planning effective. Okay, using this kind of habit-breaking formula that focuses on awareness, motivation, and tools, I just want to point out that Pat Devine, a psychologist, recently was able to lower bias on the race IAT, and that effect looks like it lasted over 2 months later. And in fact, in some cases, people had lower biases on the IAT 2 months out than they did right after the intervention. So it looks promising. We need more data for sure, but I think there's promise here. And I think the general moral of the story is that we have to practice. Right? We have to work hard to do this stuff. Implicit biases are not like beliefs. They're not, but this is sort of intramural, inside baseball is the metaphor I'm looking for philosophers, in the sense that we have sort of lots of fancy theories about how beliefs work and what beliefs are like. All I mean by this is that they're not like the ideas that we adopt consciously, that we at least tell ourselves that we can drop if the evidence suggests otherwise, right? If I believe that it's raining outside and then I turn and I look and I see it's not raining outside, I'll drop that belief right away. Implicit biases aren't like that. They don't just turn on and off with our assessments of the evidence, right? They're more like habits. And to break bad habits, we've got to treat ourselves like we're a muscle in that sense of working it out, right, over time, day in and day out. Okay, the last thing I want to suggest for a kind of harder fix is just the notion of humility. And by humility, I mean recognizing that none of us is special in the sense that we are not somehow magically exempt from all the forces that social psychologists have been telling us the world bombards us with on a daily basis. So if 75% or so of white Americans are going to demonstrate anti-black biases on the race IAT, that means that 75% of the white Americans in this room are going to demonstrate that pattern of bias. We are very good at spotting other people's biases, but not our own. Right? This is called the blind spot bias. Right? So we all kind of have a bias about our own blind spots. And I have to apologize to us professors in the room here who think of ourselves as very cognitively sophisticated. But cognitive sophistication does not attenuate the blind spot bias. So that is to say, liking thinking, liking evaluating yourself, being in the practice of self-reflection doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be free from biases. Another way to put that, maybe slightly more gently, is that becoming aware of some biases that you have doesn't mean that you're therefore going to be free of others. Right? And there's been a number of, say, like feminist philosophers who have worked for a long time to evaluate their own representations of gender, but they might be completely blind to, say, race-based biases that they have. Right? I'm not trying to pick on feminist philosophers in any way. I consider myself a feminist philosopher, but I think that we are all subject to these sorts of problems. That's all I mean by that example. And just by virtue of being, say, good on one, we're not good on all. Okay, so let me just now point to some resources in the last minute or two, and then hopefully we can just discuss whatever I've said that you might have questions about or think is worth pursuing in more depth. The first thing I would suggest is to take an IAT. They're free, they're online. You can take any different one. You can have your students take them. That's something I've done. And most of my students have found it to be eye-opening and have told me they were glad they did it. So you can just go to projectimplicit.net. It'll record your data, but it's not selling it or anything like that. And it'll tell you after you take the test where you score. And again, you have lots of options for which IAT that you take. The second thing is to do some sort of tutorials. Virginia Valian is a psychologist who's been working on gender for a long time. On her website has some really easy to use, what she calls tutorials for change, looking at gender schemas and science. And these are just series of slides that you can watch and that provide really easy sort of how-to manuals for overcoming these sorts of problems. The third is a new project that philosophers have engaged in. This is a resource that I want to just point you to because it has a wealth of empirical studies described in just like one or two sentences, talking about both ways that bias affects classroom behavior and also simple strategies that people can use for, say, this is the one that I was alluding to before about grading anonymously and dealing with various bureaucratic hassles and things like that. So this is just at phildiversity.weebly.com. And so with that, I'll just take your questions and thank you so much for listening. Yeah?
In a number of the studies from the beginning that you showed us, did the race or gender of the study participant, was that teased out or looked at to see if it changed at all the...
Yeah, so I sort of went through a lot of studies really quickly, so I'd skipped the detail. But it depends on the study, but most of the studies on implicit race biases that I was talking about had white American subjects. So they were looking at the attitudes of white American subjects toward other groups. Most of the studies on gender biases and gender stereotypes have mixed populations, men and women and mixed races. And then there are lots of studies that have tried to hone in on different intergroup attitudes from particular groups. So studies using Black Americans as a subject population, looking at Black Americans' attitudes towards Black Americans, towards white Americans, and so on. Does that make sense?
Any other questions? Now's the time.
Yes, please.
This is not a question, but
That's
can you
okay.
go back to the last 3 slides, please?
Uh-huh.
I just wanted to
Yeah.
go back to those resources you shared with us.
Yeah.
That one.
Oh, sorry, the Valiant one? Yeah. So you can, if you just, you can just take a picture, but if you just Google Virginia's homepage, she's at Hunter College, and this is on her homepage.
Thank you very much.
Sure thing. Jason?
So, I like a lot of your suggestions for mitigating the effects of implicit bias amongst professors.
Yeah.
And I think professors form a very tiny proportion of the population on the campus. Maybe a disproportionately influential group, but maybe not as influential as we'd like to think that we are. So I wonder if you thought at all about, if you've got any ideas about mitigating the effects of implicit bias on the part of students as well. I mean, do you think that this sort of discussion is the sort of discussion that we should be having with students in class? And do you have any ideas about how to introduce the topic?
Yeah, so I have more ideas about how to introduce the topic than I do specific kinds of solutions geared towards students. I think a number of the kinds of interventions that I talked about are fairly adaptable. So I think it's easy to encourage, say, if-then planning amongst students, right? But you've got to convince them that it's worthwhile. So I should say that if-then planning only works if you're actually committed to the goal. It's easy to talk about perspective taking. As a professor, I think it's easy to encourage contact, right? So you can do classroom management techniques that put people in groups that they wouldn't necessarily choose themselves to engage in meaningful intergroup contact, which is the meaningful part is important. But as far as introducing the topic goes, I don't think that, let me just think. I don't think that students require, at least in my experience, anything different than people in general, right? So when you introduce this stuff, at least my thought is, the goal is to avoid making anyone feel defensive, that you're attacking them and calling them a racist or a bigot or something like that. And so, for instance, that's why we started with the insect flower association. I've heard that when Mahzareen Banaji gives talks, she's a psychologist who's led a lot of the research on implicit bias, she just figures out whatever the people at that university don't like. So like if it's in New York, she does Red Sox Yankees, right? If it's in at Yale, she does Harvard Yale, right? And so you can show people how on an IAT style test, you have this immediate ability to associate things that you like with good words quickly. And you can do that in a non-threatening way is the point. So when I've talked about this stuff with my students and taught about implicit bias in my classes, so long as I frame it that way, I really have had very little pushback from students who think like, this is all in the past, or we don't need to be learning this, or why are you calling me a racist, or any of that. I think the harder thing is getting students to actually sort of go out and use the kinds of techniques that I think can actually improve our attitudes, and that's where motivation comes in, right? Making people really aware that their behavior is affecting others. And I thought, there's just more room for improvement in terms of kind of selling those 3 points of a habit-breaking intervention. Any other questions? Yeah.
I guess just on that, so you're saying that most of the time you haven't had a problem, but have you, and how did you manage that?
No, I really haven't. I'm sure that some people have, but I haven't had a kind of blowout explicit problem where someone really resisted or thought that I was peddling some ideology. Partially, this is probably because of the places that I've taught. So my student populations that I've been exposed to have been very diverse. Usually, the sort of white American male stereotype that I'm talking about here is by far the minority in the classes that I've taught. And so that might be part of the reason that I haven't encountered that. I was just reading an article about somebody teaching evolution at Kansas State or something like that, and having students slam the door and scream that he's all kinds of horrible things, and I just haven't I've been fortunate enough not to encounter any of that. I will say much more minorly, the one sort of critical kind of question that I've had from students, which I think is really well taken and is sort of just a problem with the literature, is I've had students say like, look, I'm Filipino. Where does that fit in here, right? I'm, Puerto Rican, so does that mean I'm just like lumped in with all Latinos, right? This research is very crude on those sorts of levels, and those sorts of levels are incredibly important when we talk about identity and intergroup interactions and things like that. And unfortunately, in teaching this from the perspective of the psychology of attitudes, I'm sort of limited to what data are available. But that's been an interesting pushback that has been good discussion fodder, I would say.
Well, I mean, just because we're both in philosophy.
Yeah.
On the public philosophy discussions of this, right, one of the things that keeps coming up is, why are we talking about race? Because social class is way bigger in philosophy. When it's not at all clear that's true, but
right.
So I was just interested to see if
Yeah.
showing up.
It's one of those problems, I think, again, in the available data, that's an effect of kind of looking where the light is good. It's much harder, say, if you're sending out a whole bunch of identical CVs to see how people evaluate them, to activate, to use a name that activates social class status compared to racial status. And so short of just asking people explicitly, what do you think about X, it's hard to assess implicit attitudes, say, towards social class, just as sort of a matter of design, scientific design.
In the discussions I'm thinking of, it's used as a distractor. I don't care about race because that doesn't affect me.
Right.
Social class might affect me, so let's talk about that.
Right.
So that kind of pushback from that way.
Right, yeah, I can imagine that. I haven't personally experienced it, but, like in the classroom, but I can imagine it.
Any other questions? Oh, let's.
One in the back.
I have found that the use of the word minority reveals a lot of bias. People who try to either avoid it, use it as some sort of euphemism, or use some terminology instead of it. But it's being used more and more incorrectly. I see it in proposals and so on, because in many instances, people might say many minorities, and I mean, that just doesn't make any sense. So do you find that the term has become so pervasive in society that it actually helps to garner biases and so on?
I don't know about the term minority itself, but I do know that terms do carry with them different significance in this sort of a literature. So when you look at race attitudes, if you describe a person as black versus African American, you get different sorts of results. Those sorts of effects can be sort of multiplied by lots of contextual factors that affect these sorts of attitudes. But I don't know about the term minority itself, but I can just say from my own sort of personal sense of things that I always feel a little awkward using the word minority. Just to me, it has like a negative connotation to it. But I don't know if I should or shouldn't feel that way. I don't think it's usually used in the psychological literature. You often see socially stigmatized groups, but that doesn't roll right off the tongue. Yeah.
Sir, how would you approach contact with a group that might naturally be recalcitrant to this kind of training? For example, in contemporary society, the issue of implicit bias relating to police, particularly white police versus black or Hispanic citizens, is a major issue, major topic of concern. One of the fallouts that I've seen is that among some white male officers, there's a significant sensitivity because they feel in many ways beleaguered. My question is, if one were to introduce training like this, how would you suggest the icebreaker?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I was just talking to Mazarine, the psychologist that I was mentioning before, and she was on her way to New York to give a talk on implicit bias in policing behavior to 500 people from the DA's office. And she was nervous because she just didn't know if they were gonna, carry her out of there on a stretcher. So I take that to mean that there's not an easy answer to that question. I think that there are groups of people who are very naturally on the defensive about these sorts of topics, and there may not be an easy way around that problem. The real experts on this are the people who are leading the debiasing trainings for police officers, and they have a national program for that, and it looks to be incredibly effective. And from what I understand from what they do is they really emphasize the societal nature of these sorts of biases, that they're not, I don't actually think this is exactly true, but I think it's effective, that they emphasize that they're not reflective of you or who you are or what you believe or what you think. They're reflective of the world in which we live. We by nature, we human beings by nature, have to pick up on categories and put things into groups because that's how our minds work. And these sorts of biases just reflect the kinds of things that we're exposed to. I think everybody will agree that if you turn on the TV, you're going to see lots of images of black men and guns, right? Even I think defensive white cops will recognize that, right? And will say, yeah, that's true. And if you can get them to recognize, again, I don't mean this to sound simple in any way, but that these are just sort of these have nothing to do with moral evaluation or responsibility or anything like that. They're just features of the world that influence us. That seems to be, as far as I know, the way the people who are running the debiasing trainings for police officers do it, and they're having success, so it's possible. So that's what I would suggest, even if it means sort of pushing past the sort of philosophical nuances of whether biases really are our responsibility on some moral level. Just for that kind of practical purpose, it seems like you can emphasize the sort of social nature of these phenomena, that they're not personal. They're reflective of things that are just out there in the world.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks.
Any other questions? I want to thank Michael again for coming here. Let's give him a clap here. And I also want to put a plug in for our 2015-16 Diversity Transformation Fund, because we are really focusing on issues like implicit bias, microaggressions, and asking the community to come up with some innovative ways to deal with these issues. And so that application is due April 17th. So you've got plenty of time to collaborate. I've been, talking with people about how to do this. But this is a real opportunity for the campus to now come together and really begin to look at how we can make a difference. That's what UACCESS is about, collaboratively creating, this kind of excellence that Michael's been talking about, really addressing issues such as this. So I'm really, plugging that because I think it's a real opportunity. You can go, we've sent out the blast, we're going to send out another blast, but really look at that, because I really do think we can make a difference. So thank you, and please eat up on the other side. Thanks again.